The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched my sister Melissa glide through the garden reception in a flowing white gown that rivaled my own wedding dress. The silk caught the golden hour light perfectly, her blonde hair cascading over bare shoulders in a way that drew every eye away from the actual bride. "Oh my God," whispered my maid of honor, Claire, gripping my arm. "Is she seriously wearing white to your wedding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I forced a smile as another guest turned to stare at Melissa instead of offering congratulations. The photographer, clearly confused about who the bride was, had already taken 17 photos of her instead of me. My dream day was becoming her spotlight, exactly as she'd planned. "It's vintage ivory," Melissa had explained sweetly when she arrived, air-kissing my cheek with theatrical affection. "Practically cream, really. I hope you don't mind, but it's the only formal dress I packed, and I flew all the way from Los Angeles just for you, darling." The lie rolled off her tongue as smoothly as the silk draped her figure. I'd seen the price tags she'd forgotten to remove. This wasn't some last-minute wardrobe emergency. This was vintage Valentino, purchased specifically to upstage me on my wedding day. 27 years of sisterly rivalry had culminated in this moment. While other siblings fought over toys or parental attention, Melissa and I had waged war over everything from high school homecoming crowns to college boyfriends. She'd stolen my prom date, copied my college major, and even moved to the same city as my first serious boyfriend after graduation. But this, wearing white to my wedding, this crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Breathe," Claire whispered, adjusting my veil with practiced efficiency. "Don't let her ruin today. Everyone knows what she's doing." I watched my new husband, David, being monopolized by Melissa's dramatic retelling of her latest film audition in Hollywood. His polite smile was strained, his eyes searching for me across the crowd. But she had positioned herself perfectly to block his escape route. The director said I had exactly the look he was searching for. Melissa's voice carried across the garden. "Natural beauty," he called it, untouched by surgery or artifice. The barb was aimed at me, a reference to the modest cosmetic procedures I'd had done after a car accident damaged my nose 2 years earlier. Even on my wedding day, she couldn't resist twisting the knife. My mother appeared beside me, her face tight with barely controlled anger. "I've spoken to her 3 times about the dress," she murmured. "She claims it's champagne-colored and that we're all being dramatic." "It's white, Mom," I said quietly, watching Melissa pose for photos with my teenage cousins, positioning herself front and center. Bright, obvious, attention-seeking white. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance with Melissa as the unwelcome star. During the ceremony, she'd arrived precisely 10 minutes late, creating a stir as she walked down the aisle in her flowing gown. The officiant had paused mid-sentence, clearly confused by the second bride appearing at what was supposed to be my moment. She'd positioned herself in the front row, directly in the photographer's line of sight, ensuring every ceremony photo would include her white-clad figure. When David and I kissed for the first time as husband and wife, she'd stood and applauded dramatically, drawing all eyes to her congratulatory performance. Now, during the reception, she was holding court near the gift table, accepting compliments on her elegant choice, while explaining that she'd simply wanted to honor the sanctity of marriage by dressing appropriately. The irony was lost on no one except those too polite to comment. "She's telling everyone she's engaged," Claire reported, returning from a reconnaissance mission to the bar, apparently to some Hollywood producer who's going to make her a star. I turned to stare at my sister, now surrounded by elderly relatives who hung on her every word about her glamorous West Coast lifestyle. There was no ring on her finger, no photos of this mysterious producer on her phone, no evidence of anything beyond her vivid imagination and desperate need for attention. "She's lying," I stated flatly. "Obviously, but your great-aunt Dorothy is already planning an engagement party." The DJ announced the first dance, and David finally extracted himself from Melissa's orbit to find me. As we swayed to our chosen song, I could see her over his shoulder, now commandeering the photographer for an impromptu solo session among the rose bushes. "Your sister is something else," David murmured in my ear, his tone carefully neutral. "She's always been like this," I replied, forcing myself to focus on my husband instead of my sister's attention-seeking display. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment that should be mine, she finds a way to make it about her. "Well, today is about us," he said firmly, spinning me away from the sight of Melissa's photo shoot. Nothing she does can change that. But as I looked around at our reception, guests clustering around Melissa instead of the gift table, photographers captured her poses instead of our special moments, conversations dominated by speculation about her mysterious engagement, I realized that wasn't entirely true. She had changed today. She'd taken my wedding and made it her audition for whatever fantasy role she was playing in her mind. The white dress wasn't just poor etiquette, it was psychological warfare disguised as sibling support. During dinner, Melissa stood to give an impromptu speech. She hadn't been invited to speak, that honor belonged to our fathers and the wedding party, but she commanded attention with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking what she wanted. "I just want to say how proud I am of my baby sister," she began, her voice carrying the trained projection of her theater background. "Growing up, I always protected her, always looked out for her, and seeing her find someone who appreciates her gentle, simple nature just fills my heart. Gentle, simple." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, seemingly innocent but choking nonetheless. She was painting me as the quiet, unremarkable sister who'd finally found someone willing to settle for ordinary. "Marriage is such a beautiful compromise," she continued, her smile radiant. "Choosing love over ambition, security over adventure, contentment over passion. Sarah has always been the practical one in our family, and David seems perfectly suited to appreciate that." The guests applauded politely, but I could see the confusion in their faces. This wasn't the kind of wedding speech that celebrated the couple. It was a subtle character assassination wrapped in sisterly affection. Claire leaned over to whisper, "Did she just call you boring at your own wedding?" I squeezed David's hand under the table, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Something like that." As Melissa returned to her seat, accepting congratulations on her touching speech, I made a decision that would change everything. She wanted to play games at my wedding. Fine, but games had rules, and I'd just learned hers. I excused myself from the table, claiming a need to freshen up. Instead, I found a quiet corner of the venue and pulled out my phone. If Melissa could lie about engagement to a Hollywood producer, I could verify the truth about her actual situation. 20 minutes of social media investigation revealed a different story. Her Los Angeles lifestyle was funded by a series of increasingly desperate credit cards. Her acting career consisted of background work and student films. Her apartment was a studio sublet she shared with 2 roommates. Most tellingly, her most recent Instagram posts showed her at auditions for restaurant hostess positions, not movie roles. The Hollywood producer she claimed to be engaged to? A quick Google search revealed he was happily married to his college sweetheart and had been for 15 years. The photos she'd been showing guests were screenshots from his production company's website, but it was the final discovery that crystallized my resolve. Hidden among her recent posts was a photo from 3 weeks ago, Melissa trying on white dresses at a Beverly Hills boutique, captioning it, "For when your sister thinks she's the only one who deserves a perfect wedding day." She hadn't just worn white to my wedding accidentally or last minute. She'd planned this humiliation meticulously, purchasing the dress specifically to upstage me and documenting her intentions online. I screenshotted everything. By the time I returned to the reception, my smile was genuine for the first time all day. Not because I was enjoying my wedding, that had been ruined the moment Melissa walked in, but because I was already planning something much more satisfying. The evening wound down with the traditional bouquet toss. Melissa positioned herself front and center among the single women, her white dress flowing dramatically as she reached higher than anyone else. Of course, she caught it. "Looks like I'll be next," she announced, waving the bouquet like a victory trophy. Though I suppose some of us are just naturally lucky in love. The photographer captured her triumph while I stood on the sidelines in my actual wedding dress, the bride forgotten in favor of the better performance. Later, as David and I said goodbye to our guests, Melissa hugged me with theatrical warmth. "It was absolutely beautiful, darling," she purred. "So perfectly you. Simple, sweet, uncomplicated. I hope you'll return the favor when it's my turn." "Of course," I replied, my smile matching hers for sincerity. "I wouldn't miss your special day for anything." She didn't catch the edge in my voice, too intoxicated by her successful hijacking of my wedding to notice anything beyond her own triumph. As David and I finally escaped to our honeymoon suite, He noticed my improved mood. "You seem better," he observed, loosening his tie. "I was worried she'd completely ruined the day for you." "Oh, she tried," I said, beginning to remove my jewelry, "but she also gave me something much more valuable than she realizes." "What's that?" I pulled up the screenshots on my phone, showing him the evidence of Melissa's premeditation, her lies about the producer, her financial desperation hidden behind Instagram filters. "Ammunition," I said simply. David studied the images, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching admiration. "What are you planning?" I smiled, thinking of all the times Melissa had stolen my thunder, overshadowed my achievements, and humiliated me in front of friends and family. Today had been the final straw, but it had also been the catalyst. "She said she hopes I'll return the favor at her wedding," I said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "I intend to do exactly that." Outside our window, the venue lights were being extinguished one by one, marking the end of what should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, it had become the beginning of something else entirely. Melissa thought she'd won by wearing white to my wedding. She thought she'd successfully stolen my spotlight, humiliated me in front of everyone we knew, and established her dominance in our sisterly rivalry. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me the blueprint for the most perfect revenge imaginable. She'd shown me exactly how to destroy someone's special day while appearing innocent, how to steal thunder while claiming support, how to humiliate someone in front of their entire world while maintaining plausible deniability. And unlike her fictional engagement to a married producer, my revenge would be built on solid truth and careful planning. As I hung up my wedding dress, the one that had been overshadowed all day by Melissa's calculated upstaging, I was already designing something much more devastating than she could possibly imagine. After all, she'd taught me the rules of this particular game. Now I was going to show her how it was really played. The war between sisters was about to escalate, and this time I intended to win. 3 months after my honeymoon, I received the call I'd been expecting. "Sarah, the most incredible thing has happened." Melissa's voice bubbled through the phone with manufactured excitement. "Remember Marcus from college? He's back in my life, and it's like we were always meant to be together." I paused my grocery shopping, switching the phone to speaker as I continued selecting vegetables with deliberate calm. "Marcus Rodriguez? Didn't he break up with you junior year?" "That was just youthful confusion," she laughed, the sound sharp with defensiveness. "We've both grown so much since then. He's a successful real estate developer now, owns properties all over Southern California. And Sarah, he proposed." The timing was perfect. 3 months was exactly how long it took for wedding photos to lose their novelty and for guests to stop asking about the mysterious Hollywood producer who'd supposedly swept her off her feet. "Congratulations," I said, injecting just the right amount of warmth into my voice. "When's the wedding?" "We're thinking next spring." "May, probably. I want something absolutely perfect, bigger than yours, of course, since Marcus has such an extensive social circle. I hope you'll be my maid of honor." I smiled at a display of organic tomatoes. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Over the following weeks, I learned the truth about Marcus through carefully casual conversations with mutual college friends. He wasn't a successful developer. He was a mid-level property manager struggling with debt from a failed real estate venture. They'd reconnected at a college reunion where Melissa, desperate to maintain her facade of success, had embellished her own situation so dramatically that Marcus believed he was dating a rising Hollywood star. It was a relationship built on mutual deception, each partner believing the other's lies while hiding their own failures. Perfect. My investigation into their engagement revealed even more useful information. Marcus was indeed earnest about marriage, genuinely believing he'd found his successful actress soulmate. He'd maxed out 3 credit cards to buy her a ring, planning a wedding he couldn't afford to impress a woman whose own finances were equally precarious. The wedding preparations began with Melissa's characteristic grandiosity. She booked the Garden Estate, the most expensive venue in our hometown, the same place where celebrities and politicians held their events. The deposit alone was more than my entire wedding budget. "I want people to see that I've made something of myself," she confided during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls. "After all those years of everyone thinking you were the stable one, the successful one, it's time they saw who really landed on top." I listened to her plans with the patience of someone who knew exactly where this was heading. Every detail she shared, the imported flowers, the celebrity chef, the live orchestra, the designer dress from a Beverly Hills boutique, was another thread in the rope she was weaving for her own destruction. "The dress is costing more than most people's cars," she bragged, "but Marcus insists his bride should have the best of everything. He's even flying in his business associates from New York for the reception." What she didn't know was that Marcus's business associates were his former colleagues from the property management company that had laid him off 2 months earlier. What he didn't know was that her designer dress was being purchased with a credit card that was already at its limit. I began attending her planning sessions with the dedication of a method actor studying for a role. Every vendor meeting, every dress fitting, every tasting at the catering company, I was there, the supportive sister documenting everything for what she believed was my genuine excitement about her special day. In reality, I was mapping the blueprint of her vulnerability. "You know what would be amazing?" I suggested during a florist appointment where Melissa was insisting on rare orchids flown in from Thailand. "If you had a backup plan for the flowers, weather can be so unpredictable in May." "Backup plan?" She laughed dismissively. "These orchids will be perfect. Marcus spares no expense for quality." I made note of her confidence, her refusal to consider alternatives, her complete faith in Marcus's fictional wealth. Every conversation revealed another weakness in their elaborate facade. The guest list grew increasingly ambitious as Melissa invited everyone from our hometown, eager to showcase her transformation from local girl to glamorous bride of a successful businessman. She'd even hired a photographer whose work she'd seen in luxury wedding magazines, promising to pay his substantial fee after the honeymoon. "I want the photos to look like something from a celebrity wedding," she explained. "The kind of pictures that make people stop scrolling on social media." I nodded supportively while privately calculating the mounting debt behind her perfect vision. Every vendor required deposits she barely had. Every upgrade pushed her further into financial disaster. And every promise to pay after the honeymoon created another creditor who would eventually demand satisfaction. Meanwhile, I'd begun my own careful preparations. Using my professional network from my marketing job, I started building relationships with key figures in Melissa's wedding ecosystem. A casual coffee with her wedding planner, a friendly chat with the caterer's assistant, a helpful conversation with the venue coordinator about potential weather contingencies. I positioned myself as the concerned, organized sister who wanted everything to go perfectly for Melissa's big day. The vendor staff began coming to me with questions when Melissa was unreachable or evasive about payments. I became the unofficial liaison between her fantasy and their business reality. "Your sister certainly has expensive taste," the florist mentioned during one appointment. "I hope her fiancé's business is as successful as she claims." "Oh, you know Melissa," I replied with sisterly affection. "She's always been a dreamer. But Marcus adores her, and he wants to give her everything." It wasn't technically a lie, but it allowed people to draw their own conclusions about the sustainability of Melissa's financial commitments. 6 months before the wedding, the first crack appeared in her perfect facade. Marcus's mother, a practical woman from a working-class background, began asking pointed questions about the wedding budget during a family dinner. "This venue alone costs more than Marcus makes in 6 months," she'd said bluntly. "And that's before flowers, food, music, and everything else. How exactly are you planning to pay for all this?" Melissa had deflected with vague references to her Hollywood earnings and Marcus's investment portfolio, but I could see the doubt creeping into his mother's eyes. More importantly, I could see Marcus beginning to question the math himself. I started attending more family gatherings, building relationships with both sides while carefully observing the growing tension between expectation and reality. Marcus's family was practical, hardworking, and increasingly skeptical of Melissa's lavish plans. Melissa's friends from Los Angeles were equally confused by her sudden engagement to someone who didn't match her usual type. "She's playing with fire," Claire observed during one of our coffee dates. "The whole thing is going to collapse under its own weight." "Maybe," I replied, stirring my latte thoughtfully, "but collapses can be guided if you know where to apply the right pressure." The second crack came when Marcus lost his property management job entirely. He'd been hiding his financial problems from Melissa just as effectively as she'd been hiding hers from him. When the layoff happened, he had to choose between confessing his situation or continuing the charade until after the wedding. He chose the charade. Melissa called me in tears after he'd made excuses for the third consecutive canceled dinner date. "He's working so hard to make everything perfect for our wedding," she sobbed. "Sometimes I wonder if he's having second thoughts about marrying someone from my world." Her world, the fictional realm of Hollywood success she'd constructed to justify a lifestyle she couldn't afford. I made appropriate sympathetic noises while privately marveling at how two people could be so committed to lying to each other. Maybe you should talk to him honestly about your concerns, I suggested. Communication is so important in marriage. The irony was delicious. I was giving relationship advice to two people whose entire connection was based on mutual deception, knowing that honest communication would destroy everything they'd built together. As winter turned to spring, the pressure mounted from all directions. Vendors began demanding final payments. Melissa's credit cards approached their limits. Marcus's job search grew increasingly desperate. The elaborate wedding they'd planned required resources neither of them possessed, but both were too proud and too deep in their lies to admit the truth. I watched their stress levels climb with the fascination of a scientist observing a controlled experiment. Every planning session revealed new cracks in their composure. Every vendor meeting exposed another layer of their financial desperation. Every family gathering demonstrated the growing skepticism of their relatives. The breaking point came 6 weeks before the wedding during a particularly disastrous meeting with the caterer. Melissa had been promising payment for the final menu tasting for 2 months, but her latest credit card had been declined that morning. "I'm afraid we can't proceed without payment in full," the caterer explained with professional sympathy. "The perishable orders alone require a substantial advance." Melissa turned to Marcus, expecting him to produce his wallet with characteristic generosity. Instead, she saw the panic in his eyes as he realized he couldn't save this situation either. "There's been a temporary freeze on one of my accounts," he stammered. "International investment complications. It should be resolved within the week." The lie hung in the air like smoke from a fire. The caterer wasn't convinced, Melissa wasn't convinced, and Marcus clearly didn't believe himself. That night, Melissa called me in complete meltdown. "Everything is falling apart," she cried. "The vendors want money we don't have. Marcus is acting strange, and I think his mother hates me. What if we have to cancel the wedding?" I listened to her panic with the patience of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. "Don't worry," I said soothingly. "I'm sure we can figure something out. After all, that's what family is for." I meant every word, though not in the way she interpreted it. Family was indeed what this was all about, specifically the family member who'd worn white to my wedding and needed to learn about consequences. As I hung up the phone, I checked my calendar. 6 weeks until Melissa's wedding day. 6 weeks to execute the final phase of a plan that had been 3 years in the making. The foundation of her perfect day was crumbling under the weight of lies and financial impossibility. Now it was time to ensure that the collapse happened exactly when and how it would cause maximum impact. After all, she'd taught me that the most devastating attacks come disguised as sisterly support. It was a lesson I'd learned very well. The anonymous tip arrived at the Garden Estates management office on a Tuesday morning, exactly 5 weeks before Melissa's wedding. A concerned former employee of Marcus's previous company had information about potential financial irregularities that might affect upcoming events at the venue. I knew about the tip because I'd sent it. The letter, typed on generic paper and mailed from a post office 3 towns away, contained carefully verified information about Marcus's employment history, his mounting debts, and the questionable financial backing behind what was being advertised as one of the season's most lavish weddings. Nothing in the letter was false. Every detail had been meticulously researched and cross-referenced. The venue's management had every reason to investigate their clients' ability to pay for services that would cost more than most people's annual salaries. By Thursday, the Garden Estates event coordinator was making discreet inquiries about payment schedules and deposit confirmations. By Friday, Melissa was fielding increasingly urgent calls about financial guarantees. "They're being absolutely unreasonable," she complained during our coffee date, her manicured fingers drumming anxiously against her cup, "acting like we're some kind of financial risk when Marcus has property investments across 3 states. I made sympathetic noises while privately noting how her story about Marcus's holdings had evolved from Southern California to 3 states as the pressure mounted. Desperation was making her lies increasingly elaborate and less believable. "Maybe they just need clearer documentation," I suggested innocently. Sometimes these high-end venues are extra cautious about their reputation. What I didn't mention was that I'd spent the previous week carefully cultivating a relationship with the venue's assistant manager, an ambitious young professional who was concerned about a recent pattern of clients defaulting on payments. Our conversations about risk management and client verification had been enlightening for both of us. The venue's investigation revealed exactly what I'd known they would find: a groom whose credit rating had plummeted, a bride whose Hollywood success was largely fictional, and a wedding budget that exceeded their combined realistic income by approximately 400%. But the Garden Estate's concerns were only the beginning of Melissa's problems. The caterer, already nervous about delayed payments, received their own anonymous tip about potential financial irregularities. This one came in the form of a carefully worded email from a concerned industry professional who'd heard rumors about unpaid vendors from previous events. Again, everything in the email was factually accurate. I'd simply compiled information that was already available through public records, professional networks, and social media investigation. The caterer's due diligence confirmed their worst fears about the viability of Melissa's account. By the end of the week, 3 major vendors had placed holds on their services pending payment verification. Melissa was spiraling into panic mode, and Marcus was discovering that his fictional business success couldn't be converted into actual cash when creditors demanded proof. "I think someone is sabotaging us," Melissa confided during an emergency phone call. "These vendors are all getting the same ideas at the same time. It's too convenient to be coincidental." Her paranoia was well-founded but misdirected. She suspected Marcus's ex-girlfriend, her competitive actress friends, or even his disapproving mother. The possibility that her supportive younger sister might be orchestrating her downfall never crossed her mind. I reinforced her misplaced suspicions with carefully crafted observations. "You know, Marcus's mother did seem very interested in the wedding budget during that dinner last month," I mused. "And she knows people in the hospitality industry through her church connections." It was a masterful misdirection. Melissa's anger shifted toward Marcus's family, creating additional stress in their already strained relationship while deflecting any suspicion from me. The third week of crisis brought the photographer into the equation. Unlike the previous anonymous tips, this intervention required a more personal touch. I arranged to meet him at a coffee shop, ostensibly to discuss timeline details for the wedding day. "I want everything to be perfect for Melissa," I explained, showing him carefully selected photos from her social media. "She's worked so hard to build her career in Los Angeles." The photographer, experienced with celebrity clients, began asking professional questions about her recent projects and industry connections. My answers were strategically vague, allowing him to draw his own conclusions about the discrepancies between Melissa's claims and the reality of her situation. Within days, he was requesting full payment in advance rather than his usual payment plan. When Melissa couldn't provide it, he suggested a more modest package that would better suit their current circumstances. The domino effect was accelerating beyond even my careful planning. Each vendor's doubt reinforced the other's concerns, creating a cascade of financial verification requests that Melissa and Marcus couldn't possibly satisfy. Meanwhile, I positioned myself as the dutiful sister trying to help salvage the situation. I attended every crisis meeting, offered to make calls to vendors, and provided emotional support during Melissa's increasingly frequent breakdowns. "Maybe we should consider scaling back some elements," I suggested during a particularly tense conversation with the florist. "The important thing is that you and Marcus are getting married, not the size of the budget." Melissa's response was predictably dramatic. "I am not having some cheap, embarrassing wedding. I have a reputation to maintain, standards to uphold. People are expecting something spectacular." Her refusal to compromise on any aspect of her fantasy wedding became the weapon I used against her. Every vendor conversation, every family discussion, every planning meeting became an opportunity to highlight the gap between her expectations and her reality. The stress was taking its toll on her relationship with Marcus. Their conversations, once filled with romantic planning, became dominated by financial anxiety and mutual recrimination. He blamed her expensive taste, she blamed his temporary business setbacks. Neither could admit their fundamental deceptions without destroying everything they'd built together. I documented their deteriorating dynamic with the thoroughness of a researcher. Every argument, every financial crisis, every moment of doubt was cataloged for future reference, not because I intended to use it against them directly, but because understanding their breaking points allowed me to apply pressure more effectively. The fourth crisis week brought family intervention from both sides. Marcus's mother, increasingly concerned about her son's mounting debt, demanded to see actual financial statements. Melissa's parents, worried about their daughter's visible stress, offered to contribute to the wedding costs. Both interventions threatened to stabilize the situation in ways that would interfere with my carefully orchestrated collapse. I needed to redirect the family energy without appearing manipulative. "You know," I mentioned casually to my mother, Melissa seemed really hurt when Marcus's mother questioned their financial planning. I think she sees it as doubt about their relationship rather than practical concern. The comment achieved its intended effect. My mother, protective of Melissa despite their complicated relationship, became less willing to interfere in what she now perceived as in-law criticism rather than legitimate financial concern. Marcus's mother, meanwhile, received her own subtle redirection. During a chance encounter at the grocery store, I expressed my own concerns about the wedding stress affecting both families. "Sometimes I wonder if they're taking on too much too quickly," I said with apparent worry. But Melissa's always been ambitious, and Marcus seems determined to give her everything she wants. The conversation planted seeds of doubt about Marcus's judgment rather than just his finances. By the time she next spoke with her son, she was questioning his decision-making process rather than simply demanding to see bank statements. The fifth week brought the most devastating blow yet. Marcus's former business partner surfaced with claims about their failed real estate venture. The timing was perfectly coincidental. He'd been tracking Marcus through mutual business connections and chose this moment to demand repayment of outstanding loans. This development required no manipulation from me. I simply ensured that the right people became aware of it at precisely the wrong time for Melissa and Marcus. The business partner's demands for repayment created a legal complication that even Marcus's creative accounting couldn't resolve. Suddenly, vendors weren't just concerned about payment ability, they were worried about potential lawsuits affecting their clients' assets. Melissa's panic reached new heights as she realized the web of financial obligations was beyond her control. Her calls to me became increasingly frequent and desperate. "Everything is falling apart," she sobbed during one late-night conversation. "The vendors want guarantees we can't provide. Marcus is acting like a stranger, and his mother keeps asking questions we can't answer. I think we might have to postpone everything." Postponement was exactly what I'd been orchestrating, but I couldn't appear too eager for that outcome. "Maybe postponement isn't the worst idea," I said carefully. "It would give you time to work out the financial details without all this pressure." "But the deposits," she wailed. "We'll lose everything we've already paid." I let her words hang in the air, knowing she was finally beginning to calculate the true cost of her deception. The deposits she was worried about losing had been paid with credit cards that were now maxed out. Postponement would mean financial ruin, but proceeding with the wedding would mean even worse financial catastrophe. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, and every door she tried led to another dead end. The sixth week arrived with Melissa in complete crisis mode. Sleep-deprived, financially desperate, and increasingly isolated as vendors began refusing to work with her, she was finally experiencing the consequences of building her entire life on elaborate lies. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering that his fiancée's Hollywood success was as fictional as his own business empire. Their relationship, built on mutual deception, was crumbling under the weight of reality. But the most beautiful aspect of my revenge was that none of it required me to do anything obviously harmful. I'd simply accelerated the natural consequences of their own choices, applied pressure to existing weak points, and ensured that their house of cards collapsed at precisely the most humiliating moment possible. As I reviewed my documentation of their crisis, I felt a satisfaction that had been building for 3 years. Melissa had worn white to my wedding to steal my spotlight and humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. Now she was facing the prospect of having no wedding at all, with her lies exposed and her reputation in ruins. But I wasn't finished yet. The collapse of her wedding plans was only the first movement in a symphony of consequences I'd been composing since the day she upstaged my marriage ceremony. The real artistry lay in what would happen next. With 10 days remaining until the scheduled wedding, I received an unexpected gift: Melissa's complete emotional breakdown during what was supposed to be her final dress fitting. The call came from the Beverly Hills boutique at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The manager's voice was professionally sympathetic but clearly strained. "Miss Rodriguez, this is Elena from Maison Blanc. I'm calling about your sister's appointment today. There's been an incident." I was in my office reviewing quarterly marketing reports when the call redirected my afternoon in the most delicious direction possible. "What kind of incident?" I asked, injecting appropriate concern into my voice. Miss Morrison became quite distressed during her fitting. She's been saying some very concerning things about financial pressure and family sabotage. She mentioned you specifically as someone who might help resolve her situation. I could hear muffled sobbing in the background, the sound of Melissa's carefully constructed composure finally cracking under pressure. "I'll be right there," I said, already gathering my keys. The drive to Beverly Hills gave me time to prepare for whatever scene awaited me. Melissa in crisis was always theatrical, but this level of public breakdown suggested she'd reached a breaking point I hadn't even anticipated. I found her in the private fitting room, surrounded by tissue paper and wedding dress accessories, her face blotchy with tears, and her hair disheveled from running her hands through it repeatedly. The $15,000 gown hung on its mannequin like a beautiful ghost, mocking her current state. "Sarah," she gasped when I entered, launching herself at me with desperate relief. "Thank God you're here." I embraced her with practiced sisterly concern, making appropriate soothing noises while mentally cataloging the extent of her deterioration. This was even better than I'd hoped. "Tell me what's happening," I said, guiding her to the velvet settee. What poured out was a torrent of admissions more complete than anything I could have extracted through manipulation: financial desperation, vendor rebellion, Marcus's increasing distance, family pressure, and the growing certainty that her perfect wedding was collapsing into humiliating disaster. "The caterer wants full payment by Friday or they're canceling," she sobbed. "The florist is threatening to sell our orchids to another client. Even the string quartet is demanding their deposit back because they don't trust us to pay the balance." I handed her tissues while internally marveling at the thorough nature of the vendor rebellion I'd orchestrated. "And Marcus?" I prompted gently. "He's been lying to me." The words exploded out of her with shocking force. "His business partner came to the apartment yesterday demanding money. Apparently Marcus owes him over $200,000 from some failed investment." $200,000, Sarah. We don't have $200, let alone $200,000. The boutique manager hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional display but unsure how to handle a client who'd purchased their most expensive gown but might not be able to pay for alterations. "Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," I suggested, nodding toward the manager. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in my car in the boutique parking lot while Melissa continued her confessional breakdown. "I've been lying too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. The acting career, the Hollywood connections, even the apartment. I'm subletting a studio with 2 roommates, and I work as a restaurant hostess when I can get shifts." I maintained my expression of shocked sympathy while internally celebrating. She was confessing everything without any prompting from me. "The worst part is, I think Marcus knows. He's been looking at me differently, asking questions about my work schedule and why I never have any industry friends visit. We're both living lies, and now it's all crashing down right before the wedding." "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" I asked, though I knew exactly why. "Because I wanted you to be proud of me," she cried. "Everyone always saw you as the successful one, the stable one, the one who had her life together. I wanted to prove that I could be just as accomplished, just as worthy of respect." The irony was exquisite. Her desperate need to prove herself superior had led her to create the elaborate fiction that was now destroying her life. "And wearing white to your wedding," she continued, her voice breaking completely. "I know how awful that was. I planned it, Sarah. I bought that dress specifically to upstage you because I was so jealous of your happiness, your success, your perfect life. I wanted to steal your thunder just once." There it was, the full confession I'd been waiting 3 years to hear. Not an apology, not genuine remorse, but an admission that her cruelty had been calculated and premeditated. I let the moment hang between us before responding with careful compassion. "I know," I said simply. Her head snapped up, confusion replacing despair. "You know, I've always known, Melissa. I found the Instagram post about buying a white dress for my wedding. I saw the planning, the intentionality. I just chose not to confront you about it." The confusion in her eyes deepened into something approaching fear. For the first time, she was beginning to sense that her little sister might not be as naive and forgiving as she'd assumed. "But that doesn't matter now," I continued smoothly. "What matters is figuring out how to help you through this crisis." Relief flooded her features as she interpreted my words as forgiveness and continued support. She had no idea that helping her through the crisis was exactly what I'd been doing all along, helping her into it. Over the next hour, I listened to the complete catalog of her financial desperation. Credit cards maxed out, vendor deposits lost, family relationships strained, and a groom whose own lies were equally unsustainable. "Marcus won't even discuss postponing," she said, dabbing at her eyes with another tissue. "He keeps insisting we can work everything out, but I think he's just too proud to admit failure. His family would never let him live it down." "Maybe postponement isn't the answer anyway," I suggested thoughtfully. Maybe this is an opportunity to have the wedding you actually want instead of the one you think you need to impress people. It was a reasonable suggestion that I knew she would reject completely. Melissa's ego wouldn't allow her to scale back her grandiose plans, even when facing financial ruin. "No," she said immediately. "I've already sent invitations to everyone from high school, all our college friends, even some industry contacts from Los Angeles. They're expecting something spectacular. I can't show up with some backyard barbecue wedding and pretend it was always the plan." Perfect. Her pride was still intact enough to refuse practical solutions, which meant she would continue down the path toward complete humiliation. "Then we need to find another way," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let me make some calls." The calls I made over the following hour were masterfully orchestrated theater. I spoke with vendors who were already refusing service, family members who had no additional money to contribute, and potential solutions that I knew wouldn't materialize. Each conversation was conducted in front of Melissa, allowing her to hear me advocating for her, while simultaneously confirming that every avenue was closed. I was simultaneously her champion and the messenger of her doom. "I'm sorry," I said after the final call. "Everyone I contacted is either booked for alternative dates or requires full payment up front. The vendors aren't willing to negotiate new terms, and the family can't cover the shortfall." The hope that had flickered in her eyes during my calls died completely. She sat in my passenger seat looking like someone who'd just realized they were trapped in a burning building with no exits. "So what are my options?" she asked, her voice hollow. I pretended to consider the question carefully, though I'd known the answer for weeks. "You could cancel everything and try to salvage what deposits you can," I said, "or you could proceed with the wedding and hope that somehow everything works out on the day." Both options were disasters, which was exactly the point. Canceling would mean public humiliation and financial ruin. Proceeding would mean even worse public humiliation when vendors failed to deliver and creditors arrived demanding payment. "There might be a third option," I added, as if the idea had just occurred to me. Her head jerked up with desperate hope. "What?" "You could tell Marcus the truth about your situation and see if honesty changes anything. Maybe he has resources you don't know about, or maybe together you can find solutions that neither of you could manage alone." It was brilliant advice that I knew would destroy everything. Marcus was hiding his own financial catastrophe and would react to her confession with panic rather than support. Their mutual honesty would demolish the foundation of their relationship while exposing both as frauds. "But what if he calls off the wedding?" she whispered. "Then at least you'll know where you stand," I replied. "And you won't go into marriage with lies between you." The moral high ground felt comfortable from my position as the wronged sister offering wisdom. I was giving her genuinely good advice that would have genuinely terrible consequences for her specifically. We sat in silence for several minutes while she processed her impossible situation. I could see her mental calculations, weighing the risks of each option against outcomes that were all variations of disaster. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "Maybe you're right about honesty being the best policy." I drove her back to her apartment, listening to her rationalize potential conversation strategies with Marcus. She was convincing herself that their love could overcome their mutual deception, that honesty would somehow unlock resources and solutions that hadn't existed before. It was beautiful to watch someone dig their own grave while thinking they were planting a garden. That evening I received 3 calls. The first was from Melissa, reporting that she'd decided to have the conversation with Marcus the following day. The second was from Marcus's mother, who'd heard about the boutique incident through the family grapevine and was demanding answers about her son's involvement in what she now suspected was financial fraud. The third call was the most interesting. Marcus himself calling to ask if I knew anything about Melissa's business connections because his former partner was threatening legal action that would affect anyone associated with their joint assets. "I don't really know the details of her Hollywood work," I said truthfully. "She's always been private about her professional life." It wasn't a lie, but it allowed Marcus to interpret my words as confirmation that Melissa did indeed have mysterious professional income that might resolve their problems. The conversation reinforced his false hopes while providing no actual information that might help him prepare for her confession. By the time I hung up, I knew that tomorrow's conversation between Melissa and Marcus would be a catastrophic collision of mutual dishonesty, desperation, and shattered illusions. 7 days before their scheduled wedding, they were finally going to discover the truth about each other, and that truth was going to destroy everything they'd built together. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The call came at 11:47 p.m. exactly 18 hours after Melissa had promised to have the conversation with Marcus. I was already in bed, but I'd been expecting this call since afternoon. "Sarah?" Melissa's voice was barely recognizable through the sobbing. "Can you come over, please? Everything is over." I found her 40 minutes later sitting on the floor of her studio apartment, still wearing the clothes from her confrontation with Marcus. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, her hair was tangled from running her hands through it, and she was surrounded by the detritus of a relationship that had just exploded, scattered wedding planning documents, Marcus's belongings hastily stuffed into garbage bags, and her engagement ring sitting abandoned on the coffee table. "He's gone," she whispered as I sat down beside her. "He took one look at my credit card statements and bank records and just left, didn't even pack properly, just grabbed some clothes and walked out." I handed her a tissue from the box that was already empty except for a few remaining sheets. The apartment felt hollow, like a crime scene after the investigators had finished documenting the damage. "Tell me what happened," I said gently. The story that emerged was even more devastating than I'd anticipated. The conversation had begun with Melissa's confession about her fictional Hollywood career, her restaurant hostess reality, and her mounting credit card debt. Marcus had listened with growing horror, not because he was disappointed in her lies, but because he was calculating how her financial crisis would impact his own desperate situation. When I finished telling him about my debts, he got this strange look on his face, she said, her voice hollow, and then he started laughing. Not happy laughing, this bitter, horrible sound. Marcus's response had been his own confession delivered with the cruelty of someone who felt betrayed and wanted to inflict equal damage. His real estate empire was a fantasy. His business partner wasn't just demanding repayment, he was threatening criminal charges for embezzlement. The property management job he'd lost had been terminated due to accusations of misappropriating client funds. He said we deserved each other because we were both pathetic liars living in fantasy worlds, Melissa continued, fresh tears starting. Then he showed me his credit report on his phone. "Sarah, his debt makes mine look like pocket change." The mutual revelation had destroyed more than their relationship. It had eliminated any possibility of combining resources to salvage their wedding. Instead of two people with manageable individual problems, they were revealed as two separate financial disasters whose union would only create a larger catastrophe. "The worst part was when he started blaming me for his situation," she said, anger flickering through the despair, like somehow my lies had made his lies worse. He said if I hadn't been pretending to be successful, he wouldn't have felt pressured to maintain his own facade. I listened with appropriate sympathy while privately marveling at how perfectly their confrontation had played out. Each had expected to confess their problems and receive support. Instead, they'd discovered they were both drowning and neither could save the other. "Did he say anything about the wedding?" I asked. "He said it was my problem now. All of it. The vendors, the venue, the guests, the humiliation. He said since I was the one who insisted on the expensive venue and designer dress, I could figure out how to explain to everyone why there won't be a wedding." The cruelty was breathtaking even by Marcus's standards. He was abandoning her to face the consequences of their joint deception alone, keeping his own humiliation private while leaving her to endure public embarrassment. "There's more," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "His mother called 20 minutes after he left. Apparently he went straight to her house and told her everything, about my lies, my debts, even about the white dress at your wedding." My blood chilled. That detail about the white dress was dangerous information in the wrong hands. "What did she say about that?" "She said she always suspected I was the kind of person who would steal attention from family members, and that Marcus was lucky to discover my true character before making a legal commitment." Melissa's face crumpled. She said she was going to make sure everyone in their family knew exactly what kind of person I really am. The situation was escalating beyond my control in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus's mother was positioning herself as the wronged party protecting her son, which meant she might start investigating the circumstances that led to their breakup more closely. "Melissa," I said carefully, "when you told Marcus about the white dress, did you mention anything about your motivations? About wanting to upstage me?" "I told him everything," she sobbed. "About being jealous of your success, about planning the dress specifically to steal your spotlight, about how satisfying it felt to watch people pay attention to me instead of you on your wedding day." The confession that should have been cathartic between sisters had become ammunition in Marcus's family's arsenal. They now had detailed information about Melissa's character that could be weaponized against her in ways that might splash back onto me. I helped her clean up the apartment, gathering Marcus's abandoned belongings and the scattered wedding documents. Each vendor contract I folded represented another potential confrontation, another demand for payment, another public humiliation waiting to unfold. "What am I going to do about the wedding?" she asked as we worked. "The invitations went out 6 weeks ago. 200 people are expecting to celebrate on Saturday. The rehearsal dinner is supposed to be Friday night." "You have to cancel," I said, though we both knew it wasn't that simple. "And tell people what? That we're both frauds who lied about everything. That the successful businessman groom and Hollywood actress bride were actually a property manager and restaurant hostess drowning in debt." The questions hung in the air like smoke. There was no version of the truth that wouldn't destroy her reputation completely. Any explanation would require admitting to years of elaborate deception that went far beyond normal relationship problems. "Maybe you don't have to explain everything," I suggested. "Sometimes irreconcilable differences is enough." "People aren't going to accept that," she said bitterly. "Not after all the bragging I've done about our perfect relationship and dream wedding. They're going to want details, and when they don't get them, they're going to speculate. The speculation might be worse than the truth." She was right. The rumor mill would create stories to fill the gaps in whatever explanation she provided. Depending on who controlled the narrative, those stories might be better or worse than reality. Over the next 2 hours, we developed a crisis management plan that would minimize her humiliation while maximizing her chances of salvaging some dignity from the wreckage. She would send a brief email to guests explaining that the wedding was postponed due to unexpected circumstances. She would return the dress and attempt to recover what deposits she could. She would avoid social media entirely until the immediate crisis passed. It was a reasonable plan that I knew wouldn't work, because I'd already set too many other wheels in motion. The first complication arrived the next morning in the form of a call from the Garden Estate's management. They'd heard rumors about the groom's departure and wanted immediate confirmation of the wedding's status. If it was canceled, they needed 72 hours' notice to avoid full charges for catering and service. "But if we give them 72 hours' notice, we lose all the deposits anyway," Melissa said after hanging up. "And if we don't, we're liable for the full cost of the reception even though it's not happening." The financial trap was closing perfectly. Every option available to her involved substantial monetary loss that she couldn't afford, but proceeding with the wedding was impossible without a groom. The second complication came from Marcus's mother, who had apparently spent the night calling other family members to share the news of the engagement's end. By noon, Melissa was fielding calls from confused relatives who'd heard conflicting stories about financial problems, mutual deception, and character issues. "His cousin called me a gold digger," Melissa reported after one particularly unpleasant conversation. She said Marcus's mother told everyone I was using him for money and planning to divorce him after the wedding to get half his assets. The irony was delicious given that Marcus had no assets to claim, but the accusation was damaging regardless of its accuracy. Perception often mattered more than reality in family disputes. By afternoon, the vendor crisis had reached critical mass. The caterer was demanding immediate payment or cancellation confirmation. The florist had already started preparing the Thai orchids and needed decision about delivery. The string quartet had booked alternative gigs and needed to know whether to honor their original commitment. Each conversation was a negotiation between vendors who wanted to protect their businesses and a client who had no good options to offer them. Melissa's stress level climbed with each call, her voice becoming more strained as she attempted to explain a situation she didn't fully understand herself. "The photographer wants to sell our time slot to another client," she told me after hanging up from yet another difficult conversation. "He says if we're not proceeding with the wedding, he can book a commercial shoot that pays better than our package." "That might be for the best," I suggested. "At least it's one vendor you won't have to pay cancellation fees to." "But the contract says we forfeit the deposit if we cancel with less than a week's notice," she protested. "That's $3,000 I'll never see again." $3,000 that had been charged to a credit card that was already over its limit. The financial mathematics of her situation were becoming increasingly impossible to resolve. The third day brought news that Marcus had retained a lawyer. Not for divorce proceedings, they weren't actually married, but to protect himself from potential liability related to their joint vendor contracts and shared financial obligations. "He's trying to prove that all the wedding debts are my responsibility because I signed most of the contracts," Melissa said, waving a legal document that had been hand-delivered to her apartment. His lawyer says since I was the primary contact with vendors, I'm individually liable for all payments. The legal maneuvering was as cruel as it was probably accurate. Marcus was protecting his own financial interests while ensuring that Melissa would bear the full consequences of their joint deception. "Can he do that?" she asked. I reviewed the legal papers with the expertise of someone who'd researched contract law extensively while planning my revenge. "It depends on how the contracts were written," I said. "But if your name is the primary signature on most documents, he might have a case." The possibility of bearing sole financial responsibility for a wedding that would never happen sent Melissa into another spiral of panic. She'd gone from planning her dream day to facing the prospect of bankruptcy within a week. That evening, I helped her draft the cancellation email to wedding guests. We went through 17 versions before settling on language that was honest enough to be believable, but vague enough to preserve some dignity. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Marcus and I have decided to postpone our wedding scheduled for this Saturday. We apologize for any inconvenience and appreciate your understanding during this difficult time. We will be in touch about future plans when appropriate. It was masterfully diplomatic phrasing that said everything and nothing simultaneously. Guests would understand that the wedding was off, but they'd be left to speculate about the reasons. "Should I mention anything about returning gifts?" she asked as we prepared to send the email. "Let's see how people respond first," I suggested. "Some might prefer to wait and see if you reschedule." What I didn't mention was that returning gifts would require admitting the wedding was permanently canceled rather than temporarily postponed. The distinction might matter for her long-term reputation management. As she clicked send on the email that would inform 200 people of her humiliation, I felt the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. Every element had fallen into place exactly as I'd orchestrated: the financial pressure, the vendor rebellion, the family involvement, the mutual confessions, and now the public announcement of failure. But the most beautiful aspect of my revenge was still ahead. The email would generate questions, speculation, and social media discussion that would amplify her embarrassment far beyond the original guest list. And I would be there for all of it, playing the supportive sister role while privately savoring every moment of her downfall. After all, she'd taught me that the most devastating attacks come disguised as family support. The responses to Melissa's cancellation email began arriving within hours, and they fell into 3 distinct categories: confused sympathy, barely concealed gossip hunger, and thinly veiled satisfaction from people who'd always suspected her success story was too good to be true. I monitored the fallout from my position as the supportive sister, fielding calls from relatives and family friends who wanted the real story about what had happened. Each conversation was an opportunity to shape the narrative, while appearing completely innocent of any manipulation. "It's so sad," I told our cousin Rebecca, who'd called fishing for details. "Melissa worked so hard planning everything, but sometimes relationships just don't work out when people really get to know each other." The statement was perfectly truthful while implying that the breakdown resulted from incompatibility rather than mutual fraud. I was protecting Melissa's reputation while she spiraled through increasingly desperate damage control attempts. By Thursday morning, 3 days before the scheduled wedding date, the social media speculation had reached a fever pitch. Melissa's Instagram comments were flooded with questions from college friends and former classmates who'd been planning to attend. Her Facebook messages contained increasingly intrusive inquiries from people who wanted gossip material for their own social circles. The most damaging responses came from her Los Angeles acquaintances, who'd never been convinced by her Hollywood success story and now saw the canceled wedding as confirmation of their suspicions. Their comments were politely vicious, expressing sympathy while subtly highlighting the discrepancies in her lifestyle claims. "So sorry to hear about the wedding. I'm sure you'll reschedule when things settle down with your career. By the way, didn't you mention you were filming something this month? Hope the production isn't affected by the change in plans?" Each comment was a small knife thrust, designed to expose her lies while maintaining plausible deniability. Melissa was learning that social media sympathy could be more cruel than outright mockery. Friday arrived with the devastating news that Marcus had been arrested. His former business partner had finally filed criminal charges for embezzlement, and the police had arrested him at his mother's house Thursday evening. The local newspaper covered it as a minor business fraud story, but the timing made it appear connected to the wedding cancellation. "Everyone's going to think I was involved," Melissa sobbed during our morning phone call. "The police called me yesterday asking about our joint financial accounts, and whether I knew about his business dealings. The arrest was genuinely unexpected. I'd known about the business partner's threats, but hadn't anticipated criminal charges materializing so quickly. However, it provided the perfect capstone to my revenge by making the wedding cancellation appear prescient rather than tragic. "At least you found out before marrying him," I said, echoing what everyone else would be thinking. Imagine if this had happened after you were legally connected to his financial problems. The arrest transformed public perception of the cancellation from romantic failure to lucky escape. Melissa went from being the abandoned bride to the woman who dodged a bullet by discovering her fiancé's criminal behavior before it was too late. But the new narrative came with its own problems. People began scrutinizing their relationship more closely, questioning how she could have been engaged to someone without knowing about his legal troubles. The implication was either criminal conspiracy or willful blindness, neither of which reflected well on her judgment. Saturday morning, the day that should have been her wedding, brought a parade of vendor bills and cancellation fees that totaled more than Melissa's annual income. The caterer demanded payment for food that had already been prepared. The florist delivered the Thai orchids with a bill for full delivery charges. Even the string quartet sent an invoice for their cancellation fee. "I can't pay any of this," she told me as we reviewed the mounting stack of invoices. "I'm already maxed out on credit cards, and now I have legal fees to worry about if the police think I was involved in Marcus's business problems." The financial mathematics were impossible. Between existing debt, wedding cancellation costs, and potential legal expenses, she was facing bankruptcy as the only realistic option. "Maybe it's time to talk to a lawyer about your options," I suggested gently. The suggestion of bankruptcy consultation was the final admission that her situation had moved beyond crisis into complete financial collapse. Everything she'd built through years of careful image management was dissolving into legal documentation of failure. That afternoon, I attended what should have been her wedding reception at the Garden Estate, not as a guest but as her representative to handle the final cancellation details and retrieve any salvageable deposits. The venue was hauntingly beautiful, decorated exactly as Melissa had specified with imported orchids and crystal lighting. The catering staff had prepared a feast for 200 guests who would never arrive. The string quartet tuned their instruments for an audience that didn't exist. Walking through the empty reception space, I felt the full weight of what I'd accomplished. This should have been Melissa's moment of triumph, her public vindication after years of struggle and pretense. Instead, it was a monument to the consequences of her choices and my patience. The venue coordinator showed me through the prepared spaces with professional sympathy. "Such a shame," she murmured as we passed tables set with crystal and silver. "Everything was perfect. Your sister has excellent taste." "She does," I agreed, thinking of the white dress she'd chosen for my wedding. She's always had a gift for making dramatic statements. The final irony came when I encountered the photographer in the garden, shooting a last-minute commercial project that had replaced Melissa's wedding booking. He was capturing images of models in flowing gowns among the rose bushes, the exact location where Melissa had planned to take her bridal portraits. "Tell your sister I'm sorry about the circumstances," he said when he recognized me. "I hope she gets to use those poses we planned when she reschedules." There would be no rescheduling, of course. Marcus's arrest had eliminated any possibility of salvaging their relationship, and Melissa's financial situation made future wedding planning impossible. But I accepted his sympathy graciously, playing my role as the concerned sister one final time. Sunday brought the epilogue to my 3-year revenge plan. Melissa called to tell me she was returning to Los Angeles earlier than planned, unable to face the continued scrutiny and gossip in our hometown. "I need to start over somewhere," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Maybe I can find restaurant work that pays enough to handle the debt payments. Maybe people will eventually forget about all this." She was leaving in the same battered car she'd arrived in, wearing clothes from department stores instead of designer boutiques, her Hollywood dreams finally abandoned for the reality of service industry survival. "Before I go," she said hesitantly, "I need to apologize for the white dress. Really apologize, not just acknowledge it. What I did at your wedding was cruel and calculated, and I've been thinking about it a lot this week." The apology came 3 years too late, and only after her own humiliation had taught her what it felt like to have special moments destroyed by someone else's selfishness. "I understand why you did it," I replied, which was completely true, "and I forgive you." Also completely true, though my forgiveness came from satisfaction rather than grace. As I hung up the phone, I reflected on the perfect symmetry of my revenge. Melissa had worn white to my wedding to steal my spotlight and humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. In response, I'd ensured she wore nothing at all to her own wedding because there was no wedding to attend. She'd used my special day to promote her fictional success and superiority. I'd used her special day to expose the reality of her lies and failures. Most importantly, she'd taught me that the most devastating attacks come disguised as family support. I'd simply applied her lesson with more skill and patience than she'd ever possessed. The aftermath continued to unfold over the following months. Marcus pled guilty to embezzlement charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. His mother sold her house to pay his legal fees and restitution. The story became a cautionary tale in our hometown about the dangers of financial fraud. Melissa found work as a server in a West Hollywood restaurant, slowly paying down her debt while living in a studio apartment that actually matched her Instagram posts from years earlier. Her social media presence became authentic for the first time in years, documenting the reality of working-class life rather than manufactured glamour. She never attempted another grand deception, perhaps finally understanding that lies have compound interest that eventually comes due with devastating consequences. As for me, I returned to my quiet life as David's wife and a successful marketing professional. My colleagues never learned about my sister's dramatic downfall or my role in orchestrating it. To them, I remained the same reliable, supportive person I'd always appeared to be. The only change was my relationship with justice. I'd learned that sometimes the universe needs assistance in balancing the scales, and patience combined with strategic thinking could be more powerful than any immediate confrontation. 6 months later, David and I hosted a housewarming party for our new home. As I prepared for guests to arrive, I chose my outfit carefully, a simple black dress that conveyed elegance without ostentation. "Perfect choice," David said, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "You look beautiful." I smiled at my reflection, thinking of another black dress, the one Melissa would have worn to my wedding if there had been a wedding to attend. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The party was lovely, filled with friends and family celebrating our new beginning. No one wore inappropriate colors or made inappropriate speeches. No one tried to steal anyone else's spotlight. It was exactly what a celebration should be: joyful, supportive, and focused on the people being honored. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, my mother pulled me aside. "I'm proud of how you handled everything with Melissa," she said quietly. "You were such a good sister throughout her crisis, always supportive, never judgmental, helping her however you could." I accepted her praise with the grace of someone who'd learned that the best revenge is the kind that looks like kindness to everyone watching. "Family is important," I replied simply. "We have to look out for each other." It was a sentiment Melissa should have remembered 3 years earlier when she chose to wear white to my wedding. But some lessons can only be learned through experience, and some experiences can only be arranged by someone who understands that patience is the most powerful weapon in any long-term strategy. As David and I cleaned up after our guests, I found myself genuinely content for the first time since my wedding day. Not because I'd destroyed my sister's happiness, that had been necessary but not satisfying, but because I'd finally restored the balance that her cruelty had disturbed. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected, aged to the perfect moment when it can be served with the maximum impact and minimum obvious effort. I'd worn white to my own wedding and been overshadowed by someone else's selfishness. I'd ensured Melissa wore black to hers, the black of scandal, debt, and social exile. The score was finally even, and unlike her revenge, mine would have lasting consequences that extended far beyond a single day's humiliation. She would carry the lessons I'd taught her for the rest of her life, making her a better person through the harsh education of experiencing the consequences of her own methods. In the end, the best revenge isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. I'd transformed from naive victim to strategic victor, while she'd transformed from cruel manipulator to humble survivor. Both transformations were permanent, which made my victory complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.